Robert clutched his spellbook, its leather worn smooth with age.
The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves.
A shiver ran down his spine, but it wasn't from the autumn chill.
Tonight, he faced his greatest challenge yet.
He was a sorcerer, yes, but still more apprentice than master.
Beside him stood Sarah, her hand resting lightly on his arm.
Her presence was a steady flame in the gathering darkness.
She wasn't fazed by the shadows lengthening in the graveyard.
She faced the unknown with a bravery that always amazed him.
Ready?
Jacob's voice was a low murmur, his eyes scanning their surroundings.
The cemetery, with its crooked headstones and gnarled trees, seemed to press in on them.
Legends whispered of restless spirits trapped within its walls.
Tonight, those legends would be put to the test.
Robert drew a deep breath, the ancient words of power forming on his lips.
He was ready. They were ready. The Sentinel awaited.
The old cemetery was more than just a burial ground. It was a crossroads, a place where the veil between the living and the dead wore thin. Robert could feel the energy thrumming beneath his feet, ancient and powerful. It was the perfect battleground. The air crackled with anticipation. They had chosen this night, this place, for a reason. The Sentinel, a creature of metal and malice, thrived in darkness. Here, amidst the tombs, they would have the advantage, or so they hoped. Their enemy was no ordinary foe. Forged from armor and animated by a dark magic Robert didn't fully comprehend, the Sentinel was a force of destruction. It was relentless, merciless, and it was coming for them. Robert traced the runes, etched into the cover of his spellbook, his fingers tingling with anticipation. Tonight, they would face their fears, their doubts, and the creature that haunted their steps. Tonight, they would stand against the darkness. The cemetery air grew colder as dusk settled over the gnarled oaks and weathered headstones. Robert could feel the presence of the spirits all around them, their whispers like rustling leaves in a phantom wind. This was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds thinned to a whisper.
He opened the ancient spellbook, its pages filled with arcane symbols and faded script. The words hummed with a power that both terrified and exhilarated him. He had spent months deciphering the rituals, preparing for this very night.
Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the silvery light of the rising moon.
"Be careful, Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "These are forces not meant for mortal hands."
Robert nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. The Sentinel had to be stopped, even if it meant dabbling in the darkest of magics.
Jacob, ever the pragmatist, checked the enchanted talismans they wore, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The runes are holding," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. "But for how long?"
Robert ignored him, his focus narrowing to the words before him. He could feel the magic gathering, drawn to the power of the ancient cemetery. It swirled around him, a vortex of unseen energy.
He began to chant, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. The words were ancient, powerful, a language older than time itself.
As he spoke, the shadows around them deepened, twisting and coiling like living creatures. The air crackled with anticipation, the silence broken only by the beating of their hearts and the rustle of unseen wings.
With a final echoing word,
Robert slammed the spellbook shut. A wave of power erupted from him, throwing him back a step. Sarah and Jacob braced themselves against the onslaught of magic. Out of the freshly turned earth before them, a figure began to rise. It was a skeletal form, wreathed in shadows and trailing tendrils of glowing moss. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, and a low moan escaped its fleshless lips. The death wraith, bound to his will by the ancient ritual, stood before them. It was a creature of nightmare, a harbinger of death itself, and yet Robert felt a thrill of power course through him. He had summoned it, and it would obey. As if on cue with Robert's final incantation, the silence of the graveyard was shattered. A groaning of metal on metal echoed from the far end of the cemetery, each clang a heavy step that sent tremors through the ground. They had anticipated the Sentinel's arrival, but nothing could truly prepare them for the sight of it. It towered over the headstones, a grotesque amalgamation of rusted armor plates bolted together, its empty helmet tilted slightly as if studying its surroundings. Moonlight glinted off the metal, giving it an almost skeletal appearance, an iron giant awakened from some unholy slumber. Sarah gasped, her hand tightening on Robert's arm. Even Jacob, usually unflappable, seemed to shrink back slightly at the sight. The air crackled with a palpable tension, the presence of the Sentinel radiating an aura of cold, unyielding menace. Robert felt a tremor of fear run through him, but he shoved it down, replacing it with a steely resolve. He had called upon a creature of darkness, a being of ancient power, to combat this iron monstrosity. There was no turning back now.
Distract it!
Robert's voice was tight, barely a whisper, but the death wraith, its skeletal head cocked in his direction, responded instantly. It let out a wail that echoed through the graveyard, a chilling sound that seemed to pierce the very veil of reality. The Sentinel, drawn by the sound, turned its head towards them, its metal limbs groaning as it shifted its weight. Jacob, clutching a glowing orb in his hand, sprinted forward, drawing the Sentinel's attention away from Robert and Sarah. The orb pulsed with a light that seemed to irritate the creature, its empty helmet following Jacob's movements with a machine-like precision.
Keep it occupied.
Sarah shouted, her voice laced with urgency. She had taken position beside Robert, her hands glowing with a warm, protective light. She was their shield, their anchor in the storm of magic that was about to be unleashed. Robert watched as the Sentinel lumbered after Jacob, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth. It was an ungainly creature, all brute force and rusted metal, but there was a terrifying relentlessness to its pursuit.
With a guttural roar, the death wraith launched itself at the Sentinel. Its skeletal limbs moved with a speed that belied their frail appearance, striking against the Sentinel's armor with a resounding clang. Sparks showered the ground as metal met bone, the two creatures locked in a macabre dance of death.
The Sentinel, caught off guard by the wraith's ferocity, staggered back, its metal limbs flailing wildly. It was a battle unlike any I had ever witnessed, a clash between the raw power of magic and the cold, unyielding strength of metal.
The air crackled with energy as spells were unleashed. Jacob, darting in and out of the shadows, hurled orbs of blinding light, while Sarah conjured shields of shimmering energy to deflect the Sentinel's clumsy attacks. Robert, his heart pounding in his chest, watched the battle unfold, his mind racing. He had unleashed this chaos, but could he control it?
The death wraith was a whirlwind of bone and shadow, its movements blurring as it harried the Sentinel. It darted in and out of the creature's reach, striking with a speed and ferocity that belied its skeletal frame. Each blow echoed with the clang of metal on bone, sparks showering the graveyard as the two creatures clashed.
The Sentinel, though powerful, was outmaneuvered. Its heavy armor, designed for brute force, became a liability against the wraith's agility. It lumbered after the spectral creature, its metal limbs flailing wildly, but it couldn't land a solid blow. Robert watched the battle with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The death wraith, was a fearsome ally, its power undeniable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was dancing on a razor's edge. This was dark magic he had unleashed, and it was a force that could easily consume him as well.
It's working, she said, her voice calm amidst the chaos. The wraith is weakening it.
Jacob, his face streaked with sweat, ducked behind a crumbling headstone, narrowly avoiding a swipe from the Sentinel's massive arm. He had been drawing the creature's attention, using his speed and agility to keep it off balance, but it was taking its toll. "I can't hold it much longer," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. "We need to finish this!"
Robert knew he was right. The longer the fight dragged on, the more unpredictable the death wraith would become. He had to seize the moment, to strike a decisive blow, while he still had the upper hand.
"Sarah, with me," he yelled, raising his hands, his fingertips tingling with magic. "Let's give them something to remember us by." "Together, Sarah, let's unleash everything we've got."
Bolts of energy, crackling with raw power, arced through the air, striking the Sentinel with explosive force. The creature staggered under the onslaught, its metal frame groaning in protest. But the death wraith, caught in the crossfire, let out an ear-splitting shriek.
Robert, something's wrong. The wraith, it's changing.
The spectral creature, its skeletal head, turning towards them, its empty sockets glowing with an eerie light, lunged. But this time it wasn't aiming for the Sentinel. A cold dread gripped Robert's heart. The death wraith, his own summoned protector, now hurtled towards them, its skeletal claws outstretched, its hollow eyes burning with a newfound malice. It moved with unnatural speed, a blur of shadow and bone aimed directly at his heart.
Robert, behind you!
Sarah's warning was a desperate cry lost in the cacophony of the graveyard. She threw herself in front of him, her hands blazing with protective energy. But even her potent magic couldn't completely deflect the wraith's attack. The spectral claws ripped through the air, tearing a gash in Sarah's magical barrier. Robert felt a searing pain in his shoulder as the wraith's touch grazed him, sending a jolt of icy cold through his body. He stumbled back, his spell book falling open to a page of hastily scrawled runes, the ancient words a meaningless blur. Panic swelled in Robert's chest, choking him. The death wraith, his own creation, had turned against him, its spectral form now a terrifying embodiment of his own hubris. He had delved too deep into forbidden magic, and the price was proving to be higher than he could have imagined. Jacob, his face pale with terror, unleashed another barrage of glowing orbs, hoping to distract the wraith. But the creature was relentless. It swatted the orbs aside, its skeletal hand reaching for Robert once more, its touch promising not pain, but a chilling oblivion.
"Robert, fight it. You have to regain control."
But Robert's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The ancient words of power eluded him, lost in the maelstrom of his own terror. The spellbook lay open at his feet, its pages filled with arcane symbols that mocked him with their unanswered promises.
Through the haze of fear, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I might have summoned this creature, but I refuse to be its victim. I will not let Sarah and Jacob pay the price for my mistakes.
Heaving in a shuddering breath, Robert focused on the faint pulse of magic within him, the energy that thrummed in his veins. He could feel the death wraith's presence, a cold, alien consciousness pressing against his own.
No more.
Robert roared, his voice hoarse with effort. He slammed his hand down on the open spellbook, the runes beneath his palm glowing with an eerie light.
I banish you! Return to the shadows from whence you came!
The air crackled with raw power as Robert poured every ounce of his will, his fear, his very essence into the words of banishment. The death wraith shrieked, its form flickering violently, its skeletal hands clawing at the air as if trying to hold on to existence itself. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final, agonizing wail, the death wraith imploded, collapsing inwards upon itself as if consumed by its own darkness. A wave of displaced energy rippled outwards, throwing Robert, Sarah, and Jacob to the ground. Robert lay gasping, his vision swimming, his body trembling with exhaustion. The graveyard was silent now, the air no longer crackling with magic. The only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. He pushed himself up, his gaze searching for Sarah and Jacob. They were both sprawled on the ground, bruised and battered, but alive. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He had banished the wraith, but at a terrible cost.
Are you all right?
He rasped, crawling over to Sarah, his hand reaching for hers. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief.
We're alive, but Robert, what was that? What happened?
Robert could only shake his head, his throat too tight for words. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, and for a terrifying moment, he had almost lost himself in its depths. The silence in the graveyard was heavier now, filled with the echoes of the battle just fought. Robert, Sarah, and Jacob struggled to their feet, their bodies aching, their minds reeling from the encounter. The Sentinel, battered but still mobile, had used the chaos of the Wraith's betrayal to retreat, its heavy footsteps fading into the night.
It's gone,
Jacob said, his voice thin, his gaze scanning the darkened headstones.
For now.
Sarah leaned against Robert, her hand gripping his arm.
What was that, Robert?
She whispered, her voice trembling.
That wasn't just some random creature. It felt connected to you.
Robert swallowed, the taste of fear lingering in his mouth. He knew she was right. He had felt it too. The moment the death wraith had turned on them, a chilling sense of violation, as if something ancient and evil had reached into his very soul. He had won this battle, but at what cost? As they limped out of the graveyard, the first rays of dawn painting the sky with streaks of blood orange and bruised purple, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He could sense eyes on his back, cold and calculating. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. Hidden in the shadows of a towering mausoleum, Brian, the architect of the Sentinel, watched them go. A smile played upon his lips, a chillingly beautiful expression that didn't reach his cold, porcelain eyes. He had anticipated their every move, orchestrated the chaos, and witnessed their struggle with a detached amusement. The summoning of the Wraith, its betrayal, it had all gone according to his plan.
They are but pawns,
he murmured, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that echoed strangely in the stillness of the graveyard.
Pieces to be moved across the board, their destinies intertwined with my own. This game has only just begun.
Robert, Sarah, and Jacob walked in silence, the weight of their shared experience pressing down on them. They had faced death together, stared into the abyss of dark magic, and emerged shaken but unbroken. Their bond, forged in the crucible of battle, was stronger now, tempered by fear and uncertainty.
We need to understand what happened.
Sarah said finally, her voice firm despite the tremor in her words.
That creature, the Wraith, it wasn't like the others we've encountered. It was darker.
Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead.
And the Sentinel. It retreated, but it will be back, and next time it will be prepared.
Robert met their gazes, his expression grim. He knew they were right. He had tapped into a power he didn't fully comprehend, and the consequences had been almost disastrous. He had risked not only their lives, but their souls. As they reached the edge of the graveyard, the rising sun casting long shadows before them, Robert looked back at the ancient trees and crumbling headstones. He had entered this place seeking to confront a monster, but he had discovered something far more terrifying: the darkness within himself. He had a choice to make. He could abandon his pursuit of magic, try to forget the horrors he had witnessed, and live out his days in the mundane world. Or he could embrace his destiny, confront the shadows that haunted him, and become the sorcerer he was meant to be. He took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. He had made his choice. He would not be defined by his fear, nor would he allow the darkness to claim him. He would fight. For Sarah, for Jacob, and for himself. The path ahead would be fraught with danger, but he would walk it, with his head held high, his heart filled with a newfound resolve. The battle against the Sentinel was over, but the war for their souls had only just begun.